Hello and welcome to this video on why it is that people wrongly believe that trees don't get cancer. Let's start with the simple facts. Trees do get cancer. It is just not something you might obviously recognize as such. This is why the misconception generally exists. Have you seen one of these before? It is commonly called a gall, or as we should be calling it, a tumor. You might not have thought of it as such. A part of the reason is that most plant cancer is caused by a pathogenic organism. This can happen in humans too, such as with cervical cancer, but we also, and generally more often, see non-pathogenic mediated cancer in humans. Unlike with humans, the effect on plants is largely immaterial, but not entirely. To start with, we can use this gall as an example. To create the gall, a bacterium will first enter into a plant cell. This is somewhat similar to how humans got mitochondria. And, as it does so, a small amount of its genetic material will enter into the plant's genome, into its DNA. And this, as a result, causes the DNA to begin to play up. The play up we're talking about here is a mutation, and that mutation means that the plant cell will begin to divide uncontrollably. And this is good for the bacterium, as the plant will now produce a whole lot of sugars that the bacteria can eat and therefore grow with. For the plant, not so much, because uncontrolled growth of anything is generally bad. This is of course not the only kind of cancer you'll see in plants and trees particularly. A somewhat more common type of cancer, depending on which part of the world we're talking about, is called the witch's broom. It's named for a very simple reason. The branches form from a relatively singular branch, and then effectively branch off, pun intended, in an abnormal way. This means you get a whole bunch of very small twigs that end in many small branches, similar in some ways to, say, ramification with bonsai. Because you essentially have one main branch and a whole lot of little branches coming off of it, it spreads out much like a broom, and the witch's broom is more of a colloquialism than an actual name. Because it's so much similar to a broom for all intents and purposes, this is how it gets to be called what it is. It means you get a lot more woody growth, but not a lot of substantial growth. Another kind of similar sort of cancer in trees is fasciations. These are somewhat similar to both a gall and a witch's broom. The difference is that rather than being somewhat spread out everywhere as with witch's broom, or with a gall being somewhat, let's say, substantial, instead most of the growth is only on 2 dimensions, meaning you basically have a flat but somewhat wider growth. And this is again very much similar in some respects to how bonsai tries to style itself, well, more accurately, bonsai are styled. The final kind of cancer in trees is, burls. Burlwood is something that you'll often see, not necessarily praised, but certainly seen as desirable in woodworking, and it's because of what happens. Where you have a gall is an individual bulbous growth. The burls are instead many of these bulbous growths growing in one area. They typically appear on the stem or branches and oftentimes in the trunk, notably in particular parts of the trunk. Because they're roughly rounded, more or less anyway, they tend to be quite, let's say, easy to smooth off, and because they're relatively slow forming, they tend to be fairly tight-knit. Because they're also somewhat disorganized in that you get a whole mass of these growing at one time, they don't really develop a normal vascular system, leaving lots of dead wood inside of it. This combination of slow growth, tight growth, and a lot of dead wood means that it's basically all a combination of wood and bark. The woody tissue, of course, being surrounded by the bark, but because the bark has been compressed and squished between the woody tissue as it grows, you get a combination of material, and that difference in material is what makes it so attractive for woodworkers. A kind of cancer that's not necessarily seen in trees, or by no means not necessarily seen, is clubroot. Whereas the others we've all mentioned are largely trunks, branches, and similar, the clubroot is going to affect the roots, rather obviously. But it also tends to affect things like brassica, cabbages, broccoli, cauliflower, similar things to that. What it is an example of the organism called Plasmodiaphora brassicae, and it infects those plant roots, the same as, say, the gall does for the larger parts of the tree up above the ground. And unlike with the gall that affects a bulbous growth in the branches, this leads to a somewhat bulbous growth in the roots. It's essentially a root-based gall, compared to the gall which is generally branch or trunk-based. You might wonder, okay, if trees and plants in general can get cancer, why aren't they really affected by it? And, well, they are, but as mentioned earlier, not to the same extent you might think. To understand why this is, we need to first understand that in order for this to happen, you do require a pathogen. Now, typically this means that there's some sort of other problem that's generally more of a significant issue for the plant in question. One of the ways that plants will try and fight these off is by using their immune system. Understand, plants don't have an immune system in the same conventional sense as a human, but instead they have something somewhat similar. It mostly involves the production of proteins that will sense that these particular pathogens are present. Once the plant detects that these pathogens are around and are possibly causing harm, it'll instead start making antimicrobials, or in other cases, antifungals, antivirals, and so on. If the plant finds that certain parts of it just aren't surviving or are actually exhibiting negative traits or symptoms from the infection and therefore the cancer that occurs, they will literally kill off that part of the plant and cause it to fall or drop. And not necessarily in all cases, but it is generally true that a plant will sacrifice either the whole of the plant or that part of the plant that's been infected for the greater good, the communist blueberry motto. The plant can range in what it removes, everything from, say, a single leaf, right the way through to killing the whole of the plant, and this will, in practice, stop the pathogen from spreading, and, well, dead plants don't really have cancer anymore, they are dead. The second reason why plants are able to deal with it this way is that, unlike, say, the human body, where if you have cells that are undergoing a process that causes them to no longer do what they should do, which is generally what cancer does, well, you lose all that function in the body. Whereas with plant cells, they tend to be able to create new cells of any kind that's required to make up for the deficiency of what went missing or what is lost due to that cancerous growth. And this is why, for example, cuttings work well, because the cells within the cutting literally go, oh, there are no roots now, time to replace them, and they start forming roots from what would either have previously been, say, a stem, a leaf, or in some other instances, just the cambium. It's also why, for the most part, the cancer doesn't negatively affect the plant for the most part. The instances where it will negatively affect it is where it actually stops the flow of, say, sap through the cambium, and this will, in the same way it would, say, affect a human body. If you have a tumorous mass that's pressing on, say, a major artery, everything downstream from that major artery no longer receives blood, and more importantly, does not receive oxygenated blood. That will mean that everything downstream from that blockage will begin dying off, as it simply has no supply of oxygen, and human cells, as with most cells in the world, require oxygen. This is why plants as a whole, but trees in particular, do develop cancer. It's just that they're not affected in the same way, and if they are, they have ways to cope that you may not consider being a treatment for cancer. Certainly, while we may, let's say, surgically remove tumors now, we generally don't lop off an entire limb, unlike a plant which does it itself. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.